I want to tell you a story about how a single phone call can unmask 17 years of a life you thought you understood and force you to make a choice you never imagined you'd have to make. It started on a Wednesday morning in late October, the kind of cold that comes off Lake Ontario before the snow decides to commit. My stepdaughter called me from the wedding venue while I was still in my driveway, engine running, thermos in my hand. Before I could even say good morning, she told me her father would be walking her down the aisle. Not me. Him. The man who had been absent for most of her childhood. I didn't say anything. I just sat there watching my breath fog up the windshield. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city or province in the comments. It means more than you know. At 8:14 a.m., my phone had rung with my stepdaughter Sylvia's name on the screen. I picked up smiling, because that's what you do when your kid calls. She got straight to it. "Dad," she said, and she still called me that then. "We've been talking about the ceremony and, well, Thomas thinks it would mean a lot if his father walked me in. You know how it is. I know you'll understand." I did not understand. Her biological father, a man named Douglas, had left when Sylvia was 4. He'd resurfaced about 3 years ago, conveniently, just as Sylvia was finishing her master's at Queen's and starting to earn her own income. He had a new wife, a sailboat, and the particular confidence of a man who has never once been held accountable for anything. I sat in my truck with the engine running and the radio off, and I said, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever makes you happy." She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for days. I hung up and stared at the neighbor's recycling bins at the end of the driveway. Blue and green, neatly sorted, the way people sort things when they want to believe order is possible. My coffee went cold in the thermos. I didn't notice for a long time. 17 years. That's how long I'd been her father in every way that mattered. My wife Renata and I had married when Sylvia was 6. She'd been a quiet, watchful child who kept a stuffed rabbit named Captain in her school bag until she was 10 and thought no one knew. I knew. I never said a word. When she lost her first tooth in the back of my truck on the way to Costco, she cried not because it hurt, but because she was afraid she'd lose it between the seats. I held it in my palm the whole drive home. I still have it somewhere, in an old film canister in the top drawer of my workbench. I don't know why I kept it. I just did. Douglas, during those same years, had sent birthday cards maybe 4 times out of 17. 3 of them arrived late. One of them had the wrong age on it. I pulled out of my driveway and went to work. I'm a retired pipe fitter, 63 years old, but I consult part-time for a mechanical contractor out of Hamilton. Old habits. I sat through 2 meetings and nodded at the right times and drove home at noon because I couldn't concentrate. The house was quiet. Renata was at her book club, or said she was. I sat at the kitchen table. It's a big table pine, the one we bought at a place in Elora when we moved to this house 15 years ago. Sylvia had helped us carry it in through the back door. She was 9. She got a splinter in her thumb and cried a little, and I sat her on the counter and tweezed it out with a kit from the junk drawer, while Renata pretended not to worry from across the room. That table has held report cards, tax returns, Christmases, and a lot of coffee gone cold. I sat there now and looked at the grain of it. My phone buzzed. A text from Renata. "Hope the call with Sylvia went okay. She mentioned she was nervous about asking you. Love you." I read it twice. She mentioned she was nervous. Renata had known. She had known before the call, maybe days before, and she hadn't said anything to me, hadn't warned me, hadn't asked me how I might feel about being moved aside for a man who once forgot to send a birthday card for 3 consecutive years. I set the phone down face up this time and watched the screen go dark on its own. I thought about the summer Sylvia was 14. She'd had a rough patch the way teenagers do, but this one had a specific shape. Douglas had promised to come to her school play. She'd had a small part, 3 lines in a song, but she'd practiced those 3 lines in the living room every evening for 6 weeks. She'd borrowed a blazer from my closet for the dress rehearsal because she said it made her feel professional. The blazer swallowed her whole. She looked ridiculous and entirely confident. Douglas didn't show. He texted at intermission. "Something came up, princess. Next time." I was the one sitting in row 4 with the camcorder Renata had borrowed from her sister. I was the one who stood up and clapped too loud and made her roll her eyes at me from the stage. That eye roll was the best thing I'd ever seen. I thought about Spark contributions. Every year from the time Sylvia was 7, I'd put money into her registered education savings plan. Not a fortune, but steady. $1,000 a year, sometimes $1,500 when work was good. By the time she graduated from Queens, between the grants and what we'd saved, she came out with almost no student debt. Renata told her the Respark was something they'd set up together years ago. Renata hadn't corrected that. I hadn't pushed it. I got up and went to the filing cabinet in the spare room. It's an old lateral cabinet, gray, from an office liquidation sale in 1999. It screeches when you pull the top drawer too fast. Inside were folders going back 25 years. Pay stubs, tax returns, receipts I'd kept because my father taught me to keep everything. I found the Respark statements first. Annual contributions in my handwriting. The grant confirmations from the Canada Education Savings Grant. A note I'd written to myself in 2009, Sylvia's University Fund. Keep going. I found the receipt for the braces, $9,400 out of pocket above what our dental plan covered. That had been a lean year. I'd taken on extra shifts. I told Renata it was fine. It was fine. I found the car, not the receipt, but the photo I'd taken the day we brought it home for Sylvia's 17th birthday. A 2007 Civic, silver, with a dented rear quarter panel that I'd had straightened before she saw it. She'd stood in the driveway with her mouth open. She'd hugged me before she hugged her mother. I remember that clearly, which probably says something about me that I'm not sure I'm proud of. I found something else, too. A folder I hadn't opened in a while. Inside were printed email threads. Renata had forwarded some things to our shared account and never cleared them. A conversation with Sylvia from about 8 months ago. They were talking about the wedding, about the walk down the aisle, about Douglas. Renata had written, "Your father will understand. He's practical. He knows what matters to you." I sat back in the chair and let out a breath that took a while to finish. I wasn't angry yet. What I felt was more like the moment a picture resolves, when you've been staring at something blurry, and the room shifts, and suddenly you can see exactly what's in front of you. What I was looking at, in that filing cabinet, in that folder, in those emails, was a very clear accounting of what I had been in this family. Useful, reliable, the kind of presence you count on, and the kind you explain away when something more convenient arrives. My phone rang on the desk. I watched it. Renata's name. I let it go to voicemail. That evening, instead of starting dinner, I drove out to the Legion in Dundas, where my old friend Hugh sometimes plays cribbage on Wednesday nights. Hugh is 71 and retired from the steel plant, and speaks in very short sentences that tend to contain more than they let on. I sat across from him with the Sleemans and told him enough. The call, the walk down the aisle, the emails, the recipe. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he picked up his cards and said, "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't want to blow the whole thing up," I said. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "You already know what you're going to do," he said, "or you wouldn't be here." I drove home slowly. I parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a while. The house looked the same as it always had. Brick good bones, the garden beds Renata had put in along the walkway, tidy even in October, a light on upstairs, a light on in the kitchen. I went inside. Renata was at the table with a cup of tea. She looked up when I came in, and I could see she'd been waiting for a conversation she wasn't sure how to start. I got there first. "I know you knew," I said. She set the mug down carefully. "Sylvia needed time to figure out how to ask you," she said. "I was trying to protect her." "From what?" I said. "From asking me a question?" She started to say something about Douglas, about Sylvia wanting to honor her history, about how these things were complicated. I listened. I let the words settle. Then I said, "You didn't protect her from anything. You protected yourself from a conversation that might have been uncomfortable." She didn't answer right away. I said, "I'm going to need some time to think." I slept in the spare room that night on the fold-out we keep for when my sister visits from Sudbury. It's not a comfortable mattress. I stared at the ceiling for most of the night. Not the anxious kind of not sleeping. The thinking kind. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, it became very clear to me what I actually had, what it was actually worth, and what the right next step was. I'd paid for the wedding venue. That's the part I need to explain properly. The previous spring, when Sylvia and her fiancé Thomas had announced they'd found a place, a heritage property outside of Ancaster, Sylvia had mentioned it was a bit over their budget. Without being asked, I'd offered to cover the deposit and the first payment on the space rental, $12,000. I'd transferred it in 2 installments from my personal checking account. My account, not a joint account. Mine. Thomas had sent me a thank you text. Renata had said it was generous. Sylvia had hugged me. The booking was under my name. I'd signed the contract because Sylvia and Thomas hadn't received their employment letters yet, and the venue required a guarantor. I went to my computer the next morning before anyone else was awake and pulled up the contract. I read it carefully, which I should have done more carefully before signing, but here we are. Cancellation policy was clear. Cancellation by the guarantor more than 6 months before the event date received a partial refund minus the administration fee. The wedding was in June. It was October. I was inside the window. I called the venue when they opened at 9. The woman on the phone was professional and efficient, the way people are when they've had this conversation before. She asked the reason for cancellation. Personal circumstances, I said. She processed it without any drama. A refund, minus $800, would be returned to my account within 10 to 15 business days. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with my second coffee. My chair. The one closest to the window, facing the garden. The one I always took without thinking. Renata had gone to her sister's the night before after our conversation. Sylvia didn't know anything yet. My phone began to buzz. Not calls yet, just a text from Renata. Are you doing okay? I put the phone in my shirt pocket and let it stay there. I called my financial advisor that afternoon, Terry, who works out of a Desjardins branch in downtown Hamilton. I've been with him for 11 years. I explained that I wanted to review all joint accounts and any standing contributions or automatic transfers associated with family members. I wasn't closing anything yet. I was looking, getting the picture into focus. He was measured and thorough, the way good advisors are. We went through everything. The rebate had already paid out. Sylvia was past 21. But there were other things. A standing e-transfer set up to help cover Sylvia's car insurance, $220 a month, automatic, something I'd set up 3 years ago and honestly forgotten about. There was a contribution to a household account that Renata and I shared where Sylvia's phone plan was billed. Small things. Steady things, the kind of things you don't notice when you set them up and never revisit. I canceled the standing transfer that afternoon. I removed myself from the household account. I didn't call anyone to announce it. I just did it quietly, the way I'd paid for things quietly for 17 years. That evening, my phone started ringing in earnest. First Renata, then Sylvia, then Thomas, which surprised me because Thomas had never called me before. I let them all go to voicemail. I made myself dinner, pasta with whatever was in the fridge, and sat at the table and ate it slowly. The venue called Sylvia on Thursday morning. I learned this from the voicemail Sylvia left me at 11:42 a.m. Her voice started carefully and then came apart a little in the middle. Dad, the venue called. They said the booking was canceled. Please call me. Please tell me this isn't what I think it is. I listened to it twice. Then I called her back. She picked up on the first ring. Her voice was tight and controlled, the way people sound when they're trying very hard not to cry. What did you do? She said. I canceled the venue, I said. It was in my name. I was the guarantor. That was for our wedding, she said. I know, I said. Dad, how could you? A long pause. I let it sit. I've been doing things for 17 years in this family, I said. I did them because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. But I want you to understand something, Sylvia. When you called me last Wednesday and told me your father would be walking you down the aisle, you didn't ask me how I felt. Your mother didn't warn me it was coming. You both decided, together, to manage me. To assume I would absorb it because I always absorb things. She was quiet. The venue, I said, was paid for with my money, from my account under my name. I don't think you thought about any of those details when you made your other decisions, so I'm asking you to think about them now. Her voice cracked on the next word. Thomas's parents are going to want to know what happened. That's a problem I'm not able to solve right now, I said. She hung up. I sat with the silence. Outside the kitchen window, the garden beds were done for the season. Bare stalks. The ornamental grasses Renata planted along the fence still standing, pale and dried but still upright in the wind. I watched them for a while. Renata called 40 minutes later. Her voice had an edge I recognized, the one she gets when she's embarrassed in front of people she cares about impressing. Thomas's mother called her, she said. She wants to know if we're having financial difficulties. We're not, I said. Then why did you cancel the venue? Because I could. A pause that lasted longer than comfortable. This is humiliating, she said. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Wednesday morning in the driveway with my thermos. I thought about sitting in row 4 with a borrowed camcorder. I thought about a kid in an oversized blazer practicing 3 lines in the living room every night for 6 weeks. I know what humiliating feels like, I said. It's been a quiet education. She didn't respond. The call ended. The mediation came about 3 weeks later. Not a legal proceeding, just a meeting. Renata had called it, with the help of her sister who knew a family counselor in Burlington. I agreed to attend. I wore the same sport coat I'd worn to Sylvia's university graduation. The counselor, a woman in her 50s with a calm, practiced manner, opened by saying she hoped we could focus on what was actually at stake. Renata spoke first. She talked about how I had overreacted, how the wedding was ruined, how Sylvia and Thomas were having to scramble, how Douglas, of all people, had stepped in to help. The counselor turned to me. I placed a folder on the table. Not thick, just the essentials. The RESPAR contribution statements, the dental receipt, the vehicle purchase record, the venue contract with my signature on the guarantor line, the canceled standing transfer confirmation. I didn't abandon anyone, I said. I simply stopped paying for a life I'd been quietly removed from. The counselor looked through the documents without rushing. Renata watched her. Then the counselor looked up and said, "These contributions were substantial, and they were all unilateral." Was there a conversation about any of this being acknowledged? Renata said, "Money isn't everything." I said, "You're right, but for 17 years it was everything when it was mine." No one said anything for a moment. Sylvia had come with Renata. She'd been sitting with her hands folded, not looking at me directly. When the counselor asked her if she wanted to speak, she looked up. Her eyes were tired. "I didn't understand the full picture," she said quietly. "I know," I said. "I should have asked you," she said, "about how it would feel. I assumed you would just be okay with it, because you're always okay with things." I let that land without comment. The counselor wrapped up carefully. There was no legal standing for anything, she noted. The venue cancellation was within my rights as the signatory. The financial contributions had been voluntary and were not recoverable. What remained was a family that needed to decide how to continue. Renata and I walked out separately. Sylvia caught up to me in the parking lot. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize. Something new, and she looked older than I remembered, or just more awake. She stopped a few feet away. "Douglas isn't going to be able to contribute to a new venue," she said. "He offered, but then his wife had concerns." I wasn't surprised. I didn't say that. "Thomas and I found a smaller place," she said. "A restaurant in Hamilton. It'll be different, but it's ours." "Good," I said. I meant it. She looked at me for a moment. There was something working behind her eyes, something that wasn't quite ready to come out yet. She nodded once. Then she said, "I want you to walk me in, if you're still willing." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know what I was going to say, but because I thought she should understand that it was a question with weight. "I'm willing," I said, "but I want you to tell me that yourself, without your mother in the room." "When you're ready?" She nodded again. We didn't hug. We stood there in the parking lot with the November wind coming off the escarpment, and then we both got into our separate cars. The winter passed the way winters do in southern Ontario, slowly, then quickly. Then before you know it, the ground is soft and the garden is asking questions. Renata and I had some very hard conversations over those months. We saw a counselor together, a different one I chose. We are still married. I won't tell you it's simple because it isn't. I'll tell you we're both trying, which is the most honest version of it. I went back to the Legion on Wednesday nights more often than I had before. Hugh usually had a stool open. He didn't ask many questions and I didn't offer much, but sometimes just sitting somewhere familiar with someone who doesn't require anything from you is its own kind of repair. My sister came down from Sudbury in February and stayed for a long weekend. She slept in the spare room and we made cabbage rolls and watched hockey and didn't talk about anything difficult, which was exactly what I needed. In April, Sylvia called on a Sunday morning, not about the wedding logistics, just to talk. It was awkward at the start, the way things are when people are learning a new way to be honest with each other. She told me about her job. I told her about a project I was consulting on in Brantford. At some point, she said, I found out about the respect. Mom finally told me. The whole amount. I didn't say anything. I thought you should know. I know, she said. All right, I said. She said, I wish I'd known before. I would have done things differently. I believe you, I said. And I meant that too. The wedding was in June. Small, 42 people in a private room at a restaurant on Lock Street, bistro lights and white tablecloths and a single long table the way the young people like. I wore a navy suit I'd had since before I retired. Renata told me I looked good. I believed her on that one as well. Sylvia came to find me before the ceremony. She was in her dress, hair done, that particular look on her face of someone who is feeling too many things to pick one. She took my arm. She didn't say much. Just, okay, let's go. We walked in together. Douglas was there at a table near the back with his wife. He shook my hand before the dinner. Good grip, practiced smile. I shook back, and that was that. I sat beside Renata during the speeches. Thomas spoke first, then Sylvia. She thanked her mother, she thanked Thomas's family, then she paused and she looked at me. She said, I want to thank the man who showed up every day without being asked, who treated being a father like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, even when it wasn't. I didn't always see that clearly. I see it now. The room was quiet for a moment. Someone near the back started clapping, and then everyone did. I looked at the tablecloth for a moment. Then I looked up and nodded at her, just once. She smiled. Thomas put his arm around her. On the drive home, Renata reached over and held my hand on the gear shift. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. The city went by outside the windows, streetlights coming on, a Friday night in Hamilton still figuring itself out. What I know now that I didn't know how to say then is that the quiet things accrue. The receipts in the filing cabinet. The splinters tweezed out over the junk drawer. The camcorder in row 4. The respat statements with the same handwriting every year. These things don't disappear just because no one is paying attention to them. They wait, patiently, with the particular dignity of things that are true, and eventually the picture resolves, and everyone in the room can finally see what's been there all along. I keep coming back to the filing cabinet, that gray lateral one that screeches when you pull the drawer too fast. I've opened it 100 times over the years to file something away and never once thought of it as evidence. But that night in October, sitting on the floor of the spare room with folders spread across my lap, I understood something I hadn't been able to name before. The life you build quietly, without ceremony or acknowledgement, is still a life you built. The receipts don't lie. The dates don't lie. 17 years of steady, unglamorous showing up doesn't disappear just because someone decides it was never that important. What happened between Sylvia and me wasn't a single betrayal. It was the end result of something that had been accumulating for a long time on both sides. I had made a habit of absorbing things without saying much. Renata had made a habit of managing me rather than talking to me. Sylvia had grown up watching both of those patterns and took them as the natural order of things. When you spend years teaching the people around you that your feelings are negotiable, they will eventually negotiate them, and they will be genuinely surprised when you stop agreeing to the terms. That's what I had to sit with. Not just the injustice of it, but my own role in letting it get that far. The clearest thinking I've ever done came in the quietest moments of that winter. Walking the escarpment trail in February with nobody around, sitting at the Legion with Hugh, who has the rare gift of not filling silence with noise. What I kept arriving at was this. Integrity isn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It's about whether your actions, over time, match what you actually believe about yourself. For 17 years, I believed I was a father. I acted like one. When that was taken from me without so much as a conversation, I had a choice about whether to absorb it the way I'd absorbed everything else, or to be honest, finally, about what it had cost. Canceling the venue wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was the first honest thing I'd done in years. It was me refusing to continue subsidizing an arrangement I'd been cut out of, and it required something I hadn't fully exercised in a long time, which was the willingness to be uncomfortable, to be the one who disrupted the peace, to hold a position even when people I loved were hurt by it. What Sylvia said at the wedding, that I showed up every day without being asked. That meant something, not because I needed the recognition, but because she had finally looked clearly at something she'd been avoiding looking at. That kind of honesty takes its own courage. It's harder to admit you were wrong to someone who was quiet about it than to someone who was loud. I don't think we get to choose whether the things we do for the people we love are noticed or repaid. We only get to choose whether we do them with integrity, whether we think clearly about what we're agreeing to, and whether we have the backbone to say something when the terms change without our knowledge. Those three things together, the decency to give without keeping score, the clarity to see the situation for what it actually is, and the nerve to act on what you see. That's what got me through that winter. And it's what got Sylvia and me back into the same room, on honest terms, for the first time in a long while. The quiet things accrue. Eventually they asked to be counted,